Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mitra Salasel, and I'm the Director of Communications at Ideas 42. On behalf of all of us on the team, I'd like to thank you for joining us and welcome you to another installment of the Ideas 42 Academy Seminar Series. Today, I'm honored to welcome the second installment of our two-part series with our extra special guest, Allison Daminger. Allison joined us previously to talk about her work exploring how cognitive labor shapes our lives, and that was a really interesting discussion. So I'm excited to present the second installment of this series. And Allison is, like I said, an extra special guest because in addition to being an assistant professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison, she is also an alumna of Ideas 42. Allison received her PhD in sociology and social policy from Harvard, and her research focuses on how and why gender continues to shape our experiences at home and at work, even as support for gender egalitarianism keeps growing. She has to date published multiple academic articles on cognitive labor, and she's currently writing a book with Princeton on the Princeton University Press imprint on this topic. She is quite passionate about translating academic research for readers outside of the academy, and as such, she offers a newsletter that offers a sociological take on parenting and family life, which I'm sure we will share with you at the end of today's conversation, but that's just a little bit of information about Allison. And as I mentioned today, we will be discussing building a caregiver-friendly workplace. And I know that Allison had sent over a couple of questions that we shared with each of you ahead of time, and we will be focusing on both of those at the end of the conversation today during our discussion. So hopefully you've spent a few moments thinking about the potential implications of caregiving in your own workplace. And on that note, before I hand it off to Allison, the way that we do things logistically in the Academy Seminar Series is that we take questions through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom client. Feel free to drop them in as they occur to you, but we have built in a significant amount of time at the end of the hour to answer them, and Allison and I will discuss them live. All right, without further ado, I think, Allison, I will hand it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Mitra, and hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to be back again for round two. As Mitra said, last time we focused much more narrowly on my own body of research, and today we're broadening the lens to look more at some of the implications of my work, as well as the work of others who are studying adjacent topics. So just a refresher on the prompts we sent over. If you are a caregiver, I'd love to hear what your employer has done for you that has really helped with your caregiving responsibilities, as well as anything that hasn't been so helpful. And if you prefer not to have your name associated with those comments, feel free to put anonymous, etc. And if you are a manager or leader, I'm curious about what you've tried as far as supporting caregivers who work with or for you, and what barriers you faced, because a lot of these tactics are easier said than done. So I'm very curious to hear about your experience on the ground. All right, so to start off, I want to talk about some of the problems, right? Some of the reasons that our workplaces are caregiver unfriendly in many cases. And then in the second half of today's talk, we'll focus in on some potential solutions. Let's start by defining some terms. What exactly or who exactly is a caregiver? This is someone who provides direct, unpaid care to dependents. That can be children, that can be elderly parents, that can be a chronically ill spouse or family member. And caregiving or caregiver is a very deliberately inclusive and gender neutral term. And this is key because caregiving is not something that is just relevant for women. It's not something that is only relevant for parents. Rather, all kinds of people provide care in all sorts of ways. Now, that said, this gender neutral language is a bit aspirational, because the reality is that caregiving responsibilities do fall disproportionately on some groups, more than others. So namely women, people of color, and people who can't afford to outsource such care. And parenting is also by far the most common caregiving responsibility. So humans have been combining work and care in various ways for millennia. But the challenges of doing so today are particularly acute, in part because of the rise of two distinct cultural schemas. The first is the ideal worker. And I should note that in today's talk, I'm mostly focusing on the knowledge work sector. So in the knowledge work sector, the best kind of employee is someone who responds to messages in a timely fashion, who is willing to go above and beyond to help the team, whether day, night, weekend, who makes sacrifices for the good of the organization and puts their career and the needs of their employer first. Now, technological changes, including what we're using today, have made this intensification of the work world possible. And in combination, we've seen economic and political changes that have been related to globalization and financialization that have increased many workers' sense that they have to do these sorts of things in order to keep their jobs. Now, in parallel, parenting in recent decades has also intensified. The ideal parent looks remarkably similar to the ideal worker in many ways. They are always on call, always able to respond to a child or another dependent's needs. They put in long hours, right? It's a 24/7 job in many cases. And they put their child or their dependent first. So let's unpack these parallel intensifications in a bit more detail. On the paid work side, these ideal worker norms are in many ways a relic of an older model of partnership and of marriage. So previously, the specialization model of marriage held that one partner, usually, but not necessarily, the male partner, would go all in on paid work, while the other partner, usually, again, not always, the female partner, would go all in on domestic work and on caregiving. And employers knew that that was the case. That was what they expected of their workers. They knew that one worker had to be providing for a whole family, and they paid accordingly, what is often referred to as the family wage. And meanwhile, women who were married were often fired or otherwise discriminated against in the workplace, right? Making it so that this breadwinner homemaker arrangement was the norm. Now, for reasons I won't go into too much detail about here, this breadwinner homemaker arrangement has declined precipitously. So as you can see in the chart on the right, dual income couples in which both partners are employed for pay, represent about 2/3 of American families with children under 18. And one further note is that this ideal of the breadwinner homemaker was never really attainable for a wide swath of American families. It's always been a primarily white and middle-class norm, so that this model around which much of our knowledge work has been produced is really a bad fit for many families as they actually are. Now, on the other side, parenting has also changed. So sociologist Sharon Hayes talks about intensive mothering. And more recently, scholars have been referring to this as intensive parenting because there's evidence that, to a lesser extent, fathers are also implicated in this intensification. So intensive parenting stresses that you should be following expert guidance. You should be investing a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of energy into your offspring, kind of treating them like a project, so to speak. And the chart on the right shows the rise in what's called developmental childcare over the past 50 or so years. So developmental childcare refers to time that parents spend in active enrichment. It's things like reading to your child, teaching, working with them on homework, things like that. In the 1960s, both men and women were spending a paltry 15 minutes a day or so on this activity. Fast forward about 50 years, and in the 2010s, we see women spending just over an hour a day and men spending just under an hour a day. During the same period, women were entering the workforce in increasing numbers, right? And so you might ask, how are they finding the time to spend more of their day with their children? The answer is that they're spending less time on housework and less time on leisure on average. Scholars refer to this intensification of parenting as the rugrat race, in a phrase that I particularly like. They've linked it to the increased competition for college admissions, as well as an increasing sense of economic precarity, an idea that among middle-class parents, there's no guarantee that your children will necessarily make it to your level, and that you need to do all you can in order to keep them at that standard of living. So of course, the net result is that there are these dual pressures in which workers who are also caregivers are really squeezed on both sides. We have workplaces that are designed for atypical employees who do not have extensive caregiving responsibilities. And then we have parenting and caregiving norms that are premised on atypical parents who do not have employment responsibilities. Now, some of these pressures are global, but the US does stand out for its unique level of caregiver unfriendliness. And perhaps the most glaring example of this is paid parental leave. Right? I imagine many of you have seen charts like this one from The Economist that shows how many weeks of parenting leave various countries offer to men and women. And the US, of course, ever exceptional, is all the way at the bottom, offering 0 weeks of paid leave at the federal level. Simultaneously with these policy circumstances, we also find that individual mothers in the US are especially likely to blame themselves rather than point to structural factors. So Kate Collins has done international comparative work. She finds that while mothers in Scandinavian countries and elsewhere in Europe point to problems with policy and structure in explaining some of the challenges they face as working mothers, women in the US often view it as a personal failing. They have been unable to make it work. Now, the result of this dual squeeze is nothing good, as you might imagine. So I want to highlight just a few of the consequences for a variety of groups here to make the point that nobody wins in this scenario. So for primary caregivers, who again are often women, one of the big costs is economic. So we're all probably familiar with the gender wage gap, but it turns out that that is in large part a gendered caregiving gap, because in the earliest part of their career, when scholars look at highly educated men and women, they find very similar earnings levels. But around the time that kids start entering the picture, we see a large gap open up, as this chart, which involves data from Denmark, but has been found to be similar in the US, reveals. Now, some of this is employer discrimination. Some of this is also that women are often the ones to flex in order to find ways to make paid work compatible with caregiving, whether that's by moving to a lower paying but more flexible firm, by dropping down to part-time hours, and the like. But this is not just a problem for people doing the primary caregiving. Secondary caregivers, often men, also feel this squeeze. There are strong pressures on men to act as providers. And there's also increased pressure to act as an involved and nurturing father. Right? Increasingly, men are expected to be bonding with their children and to be an active part in their care. And so whereas for women, it's often paid work that gets cut when these two realms conflict, for men, they often feel as if they're not able to spend the time that they want with their children. And finally, companies too are not necessarily winning in all of this. So for example, if you agree with the premise that diversity tends to be good for business, the steep drop-off we see if we move up the management chain in terms of the number of women, and in particular, the number of women of color, is a major problem. Further, there seems to be an increasing expectation among employees, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, for flexibility. Right? Employees are saying, I'm willing to walk if I do not get the flexibility I want from my employer. And as anyone who has had anything to do with HR knows, finding talent, training talent, these are among the most costly things that companies do. So that was the not so good status quo in about March of 2020. And then COVID hits, right? And suddenly parents have to homeschool and provide care for dependents without much outside help, 24/7. This did impact both men and women. There's data suggesting that both men and women increased the amount of time they spent on domestic responsibilities. However, the gender gap, right, the fact that women tend to do more than men persisted, even as both genders were increasing their time. As these issues persisted, we saw that childcare was one of the important contributing issues to what's been called the Great Resignation. As families who were barely getting by in a crisis state realized that they needed a more sustainable arrangement for daycares that were not reopening or that had to repeatedly close due to exposures. The flip side, though, is that the pandemic did pave the way for what behavioral scientists talk about as the fresh start effect. After companies had their workers doing the impossible for months on end, the idea that the old way of working was the only way simply became less credible. And as the pandemic dragged on, and as workers began pushing back on pressure for managers to return to the office, we've seen more and more companies that are forced to grapple with the so-called future of work. It's a huge buzzword these days, which always makes me skeptical, but I do think that the conditions are ripe for positive change. Unfortunately, at the national level, some of the policy efforts, the Biden administration did not go well. They were stymied by some partisan fighting, but I do think that at lower levels, organizations and companies are positioned to really rethink how work looks. So that brings me to the second half of today's talk, where I want to outline some of the ideas of what a better, more caregiver-friendly workplace could look like. Let me offer the disclaimer up front that I don't have a magic bullet solution for you. I do have some broad principles and some specific strategies and tactics to recommend, but I am very interested in hearing your perspective on these issues in your particular workplace. So let's start with the underlying principles. What exactly do caregivers need? It's pretty simple. They need flexibility, they need predictability, and they need to not be penalized for actually taking advantage of flexibility and predictability. I also want to underscore the point that these are helpful for all workers, regardless of their caregiving status. Yes, caregivers' needs may be particularly acute, but it's hard to imagine who wouldn't benefit from increased flexibility and predictability. I think recognizing the broader applicability of these principles is also going to be key to building a coalition for change. For example, a work-life committee that is made up entirely of 30 and 40-something mothers is likely to be much less effective than a group that combines people of various ages, genders, and life stages who recognize that they too would benefit from these changes. Okay, so flexibility. In general, I'm using this to mean that employees have more discretion over how they work. And that flexibility can and should be multidimensional. So for example, where are you working? Are you working from an office, co-working space, your couch, some mixture of all of the above? When are you working? Do you have a standard 9-to-5 shift, a split shift where you come back online after the kids are asleep? Are you able to move things around if you have a Friday afternoon doctor's appointment? And finally, flexibility also means giving employees some latitude over how much integration they would like between their paid and unpaid work responsibilities. So some employees will prefer to really sharply segment their work and their home time, whereas others will find it much easier to kind of seamlessly blur back and forth between those two realms, folding laundry on a conference call, etc. And I want to note that while a lot of the conversation tends to be around parents of young children, especially when we're talking about parental leave, flexibility is important for caregivers of all stripes. So, for example, as kids get older, the physical caregiving demands lessen somewhat, but I find in my research that the cognitive labor demands only ratchet up as there are more players to take into account. Children have schedules of their own, they have teachers, they have coaches. Eventually, they have to start thinking about college and beyond. So this flexibility is something that is not just about the early years of parenting. Second, employees need predictability, right? So advance notice of changes in what's going to be expected of them or demanded of them. So a heads up when after hours work will be needed, when a shift or schedule might change, or when there are upcoming deadlines that could get pushed up or pushed back and so on. Because without that advance warning, caregivers can't make contingency plans. Now, I was speaking with a friend the other day who noted her frustration that she had to cancel brunch plans with a friend. So predictability, again, is good for everyone, but the stakes are often higher for caregivers than canceling brunch. Finally, and perhaps most critically, caregivers need to be free from the stigma or penalties that often accompany actually taking advantage of these flexible and predictable work policies. Because considerable research suggests that when you request or explicitly take advantage of flexibility, you're going to be disadvantaged in some way. Face time tends to be equated with quality and overwork with commitment. And so when workers request to have a telecommuting arrangement or things like that, they're seen as not ideal workers. And there's some research suggesting that in particular, when you ask for flexibility for personal reasons, as opposed to productivity reasons, such as, I work better, not in an open office, that those personal reasons are especially dangerous and can be harmful for employees' careers. Second, the perception of disadvantage, whether or not it's actually true, discourages uptake for the policies that are available. So for example, a number of countries around the world and organizations offer men some amount of paid parental leave. But this benefit tends to be underutilized, in part because the theory goes that men do not necessarily feel comfortable taking advantage of the policy. There's also some fascinating research looking at what's called passing for an ideal worker. So Reed studied high-paid consultants, and she found that there were gender differences in the uptake of official flexibility policies. That is, women were disproportionately the ones to request to reduce their hours or to have other accommodations. Meanwhile, men were passing. They were taking the conference call from their child's soccer game. They were emailing from the ski retreat. They were not officially taking advantage of the policy, but they were finding some workarounds. And I think that the early evidence suggests this is going to be a really central tension for companies in our new world of work. Because already we're seeing demographic differences in who is interested in remote and hybrid work. And without careful safeguards, there's a risk that this flexibility will actually reinforce existing hierarchies. I think it's important that both policy and culture change. Because if you rely on culture alone, what you're going to have is a lot of case-by-case solutions. So companies often try to implement these flexibility policies by leaving it up to manager discretion. That tends to produce both uneven and unstable access. So Kelly and Moen, organizational scholars, call this the flexibility as accommodation problem. And they argue that rather than individuals having to go to their manager and hope that they will grant their request, What we need is a more concerted effort to redesign the way work is done at an organization. On the flip side, if you change the policy, but not the culture, right, not the unwritten expectations or norms, you're going to run into problems, like I mentioned a minute ago, where people aren't comfortable taking advantage of available policies, or where people are sort of dividing themselves into unofficial versus official accommodations tracks. So in the remainder of our time together, I want to outline 5 strategies, as well as some more concrete tactics that organizations might consider. Not all of them are going to be equally applicable to every organization, but I hope that there's at least something in there that might resonate with you. So first and foremost, we need to redefine the ideal worker. That is a change that ideally needs to happen at the societal level, but individual organizations can likely make some headway at a more modest scale. So above all, this is going to mean prioritizing outputs over inputs, right? What some are calling the results-only approach. Now, for knowledge work in particular, this is challenging because, as you know, we're not producing widgets, right? So what do measurable results look like? I think that figuring that out for a particular company or particular worker is a key first step. This also means changing the way that we measure and celebrate success. So for example, it should show up in formal performance evaluations that we are not commenting on how responsive this employee is, how available they are, how often we see them at company events, but rather on the value they produce for the company. And finally, this redefinition can happen at the level of individual conversations, right? It's common for people to ask, how are you? Oh, I'm super busy. I worked all weekend. And for those to be badges of honor, so to speak. And so I think successful companies will discourage that kind of communication. In addition to changing the metrics for success, organizations also need to come up with ways to make overwork less necessary. Again, this will vary by field, but one thing this could look like is managing client expectations. If the norm has historically been 24/7 availability or at your beck and call, could you slightly revise that? Maybe 24/6 availability, or we are going to have a dedicated call every day for an hour, rather than this ad hoc constant availability. If that's not possible, one thing that organizations have been doing is rotating on-call duties, where they're being very explicit about who is responsible for taking those urgent after-hours requests. And part of that is ensuring that there's not just one person who holds the relationship or who has the skills necessary, right? But they're building in redundancies or backups so that the on-call time doesn't fall on just one person. And finally, I think reducing dependence on overwork is going to involve changing the way we forecast and make predictions about time and resources needed to complete a project. So the planning fallacy, I'm sure, is familiar to many of you on the call today. And that is a big part of what is driving overwork. People are promising things that they can't necessarily deliver, right? They're being overly optimistic about the time and resources it will take, and that is leading to scrambling to meet deadlines. Third, assuming that flexibility in where you work is going to be a big part of a broader solution, we need to think about not just a work from home free-for-all, but by putting in some clear expectations. So for example, some organizations are specifying flex versus core hours. So during core hours, everyone is expected to be online, available for meetings. And during the flex hours, right, they have leeway to take time off, to handle personal responsibilities, take breaks, etc. And a similar strategy could work at the level of the day. If you have teams who are hybrid, Wednesday could be the core in-office day, where there are other flex days that people are able to allocate as they see fit. And similarly, I think one challenge with hybrid work is that in-office time is not coordinated. And as a result, it's not clear what the purpose of coming to the office is. And people are also missing out on what researchers have found to be the primary benefits of in-person collaboration. So teamwork, relationship building, these sorts of things are especially useful for new, younger employees who are just starting their careers. And so by not just specifying that you should come to the office sometimes, but putting expectations around exactly when and what we'll do during those times, that's one way to help with those challenges. Fourth, we need to invest in hybrid work. It increasingly seems that that's going to be the way of the future. And what that means is that, some people are in person, some are virtual, and without a good investment in improving the experiences of both groups, the risk is that virtual participants are going to be more like second-class citizens. So meetings are a key place where this shows up. I've read some organizations that have a policy where if one person dials in, all dial in. I'd be curious to get your thoughts on this. I personally think that it's more effective to have an in-person facilitator who is in charge of keeping track of the virtual participants, right? Making sure that they are included, reminding people in the room who have a tendency to forget about the virtual participants to check the chat. This person has their hand raised, and so on, can help to facilitate that. And second, I think we need to train frontline managers on virtual and hybrid leadership, because otherwise there's a strong risk that managers who have been accustomed to relying on FaceTime and interpersonal exchanges as a metric for commitment and for success are going to be sort of subtly favoring those who they have more in-person contact with. Finally, I think we need to practice what we preach. So this is particularly true for those at more senior levels, because a lot of recent data suggests that executives are less interested in remote work than those who are lower down in the hierarchy. And so one consequence of this is that executives may be in the office much more than their subordinates. They may tell their employees that it's fine to work from home, but as we know, actions tend to speak louder than words. So one thing to consider is perhaps setting upper as well as lower bounds on the number of days people can work from the office or from home. This could destigmatize working from home, right? The executives are doing it too. It could also build empathy by ensuring that everyone experiences both sides. Everyone has been the Zoom participant on a hybrid meeting. Everyone has been in the office. Right, so by specifically focusing on the behaviors of executives and making sure that those are in line with the changes you're trying to make, you can encourage uptake and destigmatize flexibility. I want to just briefly shout out some of the sources I consulted for today's talk. I cited some of the academic ones, but these are all much more practitioner-friendly, so to speak. In particular, I recommend Kelly and Moen's 2020 book, Overload, which talks in a lot of detail about a randomized control trial they did of a work redesign that was designed to, not necessarily just for caregivers, but to make work more sustainable and flexible for all workers. And so with that, I want to turn it to our discussion. So again, just to remind you, I'm especially interested in hearing your stories about what has worked, what hasn't worked, what you've tried if you are on the management side of things. And of course, the usual Q&A is all fair game as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Allison. One thing I will say as well, while we give everyone on the line a couple of moments to, throw their comments, responses to Allison's two main discussion prompts or any other questions that you might have into the Q&A box, is that this is also a subject area that Ideas 42 has recently delved into with our own paper that similarly seeks to reframe the ideal worker norm into more of an like equitable ideal workplace. So it's been really interesting to see similar kinds of frameworks, similar kinds of insights applied here. And if each of you on the line is looking for another resource, I would highly recommend checking out our own white paper as well, called From Ideal Worker to Ideal Workplace. I believe it also draws from a lot of the same sources. So
Amazing.
I am required to give a plug for Ideas 42 material as well. So great. So we have one question in here that is a little bit different from the existing prompts, but I am curious, Allison, your perspective on this. Could you talk a little bit about caregiving in low-income populations, particularly in the global South, in terms of labor rights? And I'm not sure if your research has kind of delved into those very different contexts from what I think we're talking about here, which is, the Western and mostly, I would assume, US-centric kind of focus at this point. But the global South has different challenges during the process of looking for jobs, and women face challenges due to employers resisting women because of the requirements of provisioning caregiving services for women. So similar kinds of issues, but I think maybe, it might be a little bit more intense in other like lower income global South contexts. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I will admit that my research is primarily focused on the US and on Western context, so I'm hesitant to speak too much to the global South. One thing I can speak about, though, is low-income context in the US. As I said, I focused more on the knowledge work context, but a number of these issues, particularly around predictability, show up when we're talking about shift work, et cetera. So Danny Schneider and his colleagues have done a number of studies on just-in-time scheduling, practiced by places like Walmart and other similar employers, where these lean staffing models have led to significantly reduced predictability in terms of when you're going to be scheduled. Shifts tend to be irregular, you're on call in a different sort of way, and often end up with fewer total hours than you would like. So the additional problem on top of caregiving is financially, how can you make ends meet? So there has been some success, some movement in these companies where they are, trying to move away from this just-in-time scheduling, or they are facilitating shift swapping among employees rather than leaving it just up to individuals to coordinate. But that seems to be a huge challenge in kind of the other end of the income spectrum, is how do you get people to a place where they have enough hours, and those hours are consistent, or at least they have enough advance notice. That's kind of the big difference that I've read about in that realm.
Great, thank you, Allison. I haven't seen anything else pop up in the Q&A section yet, so please do not be shy, don't be scared. This is a safe space to provide any of your own experiences, either as a manager or as a caregiver, or if you have any other questions for Allison. I will kick us off just to get the discussion going. So from my perspective, like as a caregiver, I can share, and I'm in one of those unique situations where I'm not a parent, but I do have a caregiving obligation for a parent. And so it is interesting because it's a little bit different than like going on parental leave or something. So a lot of the formal kind of policies are not quite the same as for example, Ideas 42 has really, really generous parental leave policies. And we've built into how, the organization basically functions, from like budgeting for and all of our operations, people to take that paid leave. And we have demonstrated norms of leaders taking the time that they have available to them. So that's one thing. But from my perspective, as a person who has not utilized parental leave, but rather just as a caregiver, I would say one of the most helpful things that, Ideas 42 does is something that I think is kind of, it's a little bit squishier, but people often overlook how helpful it is, which is people really just ask, like, what can we do to help you? And kind of look at it from the human perspective, and model a norm of saying it's okay to take more time and more flexibility if you need to. And I feel that our policies are not just something that's written down, but they are norms that are lived in the day-to-day operations of the organization. And I feel comfortable saying, today is one of those days where, we don't have an external caregiver, or I have to be on like care duty there and emergencies come up. So, I'm not going to be available for the rest of the day. And it's not a problem. There's always somebody to step in, or more importantly, I think in terms of changing the idea of like what an ideal worker is, like it's made clear to me that it's okay to wait to pick up work, and that there's no pressure to get it done immediately or always be on call. So I don't know if maybe that's something that you've found in some of your research with others as something that's helpful, but just kicking off the group of participants here with an example from my own life that maybe is helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Mitra. So I think what you're really pointing to there is that it's policy and informal culture working together.
Mhm.
And if you have the policy, but you feel like your manager is disappointed when you're not around, they're annoyed that you're always taking this time off, that is going to substantially decrease the likelihood that you'll take advantage of it, that you'll feel comfortable talking about your particular demands at work, right? I think a lot of people try to hide it, they try to pass, but when there is a culture of let's share what our needs are, it's not just a top-down approach, but it sounds like your peers are also interested in caring. I think that sounds like a great example of sort of the mesh between policy and unwritten rules.
Absolutely. And as expected, all I had to do was share a deeply personal example, and now the questions are rolling in. So the first one is from Josh, who says that the funding models in the nonprofit world, meaning limited overhead rates or funding that is very lean, make creating more redundancy to enable coverage, particularly for senior people to actually unplug for longer periods of time, ranges from very challenging to near impossible. Do you have any thoughts, Allison, about how this might change, or ways that organizations can better deal with this, given the realities of nonprofit funding?
Yeah, Josh, that's a tough one, right? So I think corporations, for-profit corporations experience a version of this when they're, having to answer for quarterly returns to shareholders. Neither model really lends itself to this kind of more generous staffing approach. So I think my read of the literature suggests that if you cannot build in redundancies in terms of hiring extra staff, that thinking more strategically about who holds relationships and who is able to kind of take that 10 p.m. call or deal with that 10 p.m. issue is one way that organizations seem to deal with that. So, in consulting and law, in some of Ideas 42's work, the tendency is, I need to go to the partner, I need to go to the manager, whoever I've been working with, if I'm the client. And I think if we facilitate relationships where, okay, you're not getting the second best, right? Like, you know, this person really well, they are also available. That can at least sort of lessen the load somewhat. So I think trying to, even if you can't hire more people, thinking about strategic ways to build those client relationships such that there's some overlap and there isn't just this dependence on one person for that on-call stuff. But yeah, I agree. It's a challenge.
Thank you. So this is an interesting question from K, the letter K. I live in Washington, D.C. Business and government don't seem to care that the old model no longer works. They don't seem interested in changing the model. They want to force workers back into the old model rather than begin to think about decentralization. So how can we change the larger culture? And so, to editorialize a little bit, to me, like, is that more around shifting from that norm of like an ideal worker into an ideal workplace?
Yes. So ideally, I think that's exactly what you want to be doing. I think what Kay is pointing to is a kind of flaw in the premise for this sort of talk, where we assume that your employer cares and wants to be a caregiver-friendly workplace. And unfortunately, I don't think that is universally true. So, one macro level trend is that through the Great Resignation and other forces, employees are voting with their feet, right? And they're saying, okay, my company is forcing me to go back into the office 5 days a week. I'm going to look for more flexible accommodations. So it's not necessarily a great individual strategy. It may or may not be possible for you to consider such a job switch. But the hope is that employers get the signal that if they want talent, right, they need to meet these new expectations. The other piece of this too is that in an earlier draft of the presentation, I had this complicated slide about how structural change and organizational change, institutional change, because this is a multi-level problem, right? The ideal worker norm is something that goes well beyond individual organizations and is really built into American culture in a lot of ways. So I do think that, despite some of the kind of frustrating losses that the Biden administration faced when they were trying to improve work-family policy, I think those efforts need to continue. Some companies may not make these sorts of changes if they are not compelled to. I also think that, for individuals who don't have a lot of institutional power, things like the language you use, the way that you respond when your coworkers are doing kind of relatively non-traditional things in terms of their work hours or their work schedule, that normalizing the flexible working pattern is another way that you can sort of try to be the change you wish to see in the world, so to speak.
Great, thank you. And I think, for those of you who attended the last conversation that we had with Allison, there was a question that kind of touched on narratives a little bit more explicitly. And so, I believe we devoted a couple of minutes to this, but just to like confirm, Allison, are you saying that something like this kind of phenomenon and like shifting culture at the systems level in workplaces in the United States and beyond, like is an area where, a narrative change approach would also be key to shifting those norms and the culture?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And that's, one of the reasons that we talk about caregivers rather than mothers, for example, is that I think that the hope is to change people's implicit image of what a parent looks like, what a caregiver looks like, to broaden our understanding, and something similar when it comes to the valorization of particular ways of working. I think if we stop sort of saying, wow, like you're working so hard, I see you all the time, like you're really burning the midnight oil, if those kinds of very, well-meaning conversational tendencies are part of this broader reinforcement of a set of values and norms. So yeah, basically exactly right, Mita.
Great. This is a good transition to a question from Piyush. Has anyone studied whether norms around how quickly you must respond to messages are a barrier to flexibility? You know, do instant messaging platforms like GChat or Slack have an impact on this?
Yeah, so I think I'm trying to think of specific studies that have tested this. So I have seen conversations about Slack, instant messaging, more discussed as part of like a broader conversation about the always on work expectation. I'll have to, I'm curious if there have been particular studies looking at that. But what I've seen has been more of a holistic, you are expected to be always on, and one of the key channels, right, is if not email, then Slack, instant messaging. I've also seen some work looking at the different kind of implicit rules of the game when it comes to email versus instant messaging. And they find that in a lot of cultures, company cultures, email is understood as an asynchronous communication, whereas instant messaging, Slack, is understood to be more synchronous. And I think part of the expectation is okay, if I'm IMing you at all hours of the night, I'm sort of trained to expect a response. And even if that's not stated, if that's like the unofficial way that most people work, I think employees end up feeling that pressure to respond. Whereas, using other channels like email, they have a little bit more leeway. But yeah, I'm curious to follow up and see if there are particular studies that have kind of compared the effects of, say, Slack versus email, rather than looking at this more holistic technology picture.
Absolutely. So we have a couple of questions left, and we do have 6 minutes left in the hour. So if you have any other questions for Allison or any other perspectives on either of these prompts, there's a few minutes to get them in there. I don't think we have touched on the perspective of managers or leaders who have tried to address the needs of caregivers and any challenges or obstacles. So I know we would welcome that perspective for sure. But in the meantime, we can turn to one of the existing questions. Allison, have you found differences in your work or in the work of others in how men versus women are perceived professionally when they are seen as caregivers or are willing to take advantage of any flexibility or benefits?
Yes, there is a large and growing literature on this topic. So I'll touch on a few examples, but if you're interested, there's a lot here. So one is, the perception that it is normative for new mothers to ask for leave and to need parental leave, and that it is not normative for new fathers. So there's a lot of evidence that fathers who try to work part-time, try to take more leave, that is particularly stigmatizing for them because it goes against these more masculine norms. And so I think part of what we're seeing in studies like the one that finds that men are less likely to take official advantage of flexibility policies is attempts to sort of circumvent that stigma. At the same time, there's a lot of research suggesting that on the whole, employers assume that women are less committed than men. So this shows up in a number of metrics, probably most famously what's called the motherhood penalty and the fatherhood premium, where if you take comparable mothers and compare them to non-mothers, you'll see that women who are not mothers tend to earn more. We see something that's reversed for fathers. And when scholars have looked into this, probed it further, they've done some interesting studies asking people to evaluate resumes, where in one set of cases, there are primes for a parenting commitment, PTA, et cetera. And when women are sort of hypothetically judged, they come up as less competent, less capable, all these metrics if they have some signals on their resume that they have a parenting commitment. So I would say that in general, parenting is assumed to be more of a burden for women and that they kind of get that blanket penalty. But when men lean into their caregiving responsibilities, that sometimes backfires on them. They're seen as going against ideas about men as more providers and not caregivers.
Thank you. Speaking of lean in, we have one more question that I think we have time for, and this is also from Josh. How much do you think the lean in perspective has hurt these efforts? And that is, of course, referring to I think it's Sheryl Sandberg book that was a frenzy in the business world around 2010, 2011.
Yeah, so I personally am not a fan of the lean-in approach because it, I love the title of the white paper that you mentioned, Mitra, because I think that's a classic example of saying, it is your fault, individual worker, right? Individual mother, woman, etc. You are not doing a good enough job. You're not trying hard enough. You're not finding good strategies. And that perspective really, really severely overlooks the broader forces that structure our choices and make it possible for some people to, quote, lean in or lean out. So I think as a manifestation of a broader cultural expectation that we are individuals, we are responsible for solving our own problems. I don't fault lean in per se. I think it's more a symptom than a cause. But I do think it points us in the wrong direction if we're looking to make sustainable change.
Great. All right. Well, it is 1 minute until the end of the hour, and we don't have many more questions coming in on deck. So with that, I would like to thank Allison for spending 2 separate hours with us, giving us a look at your work and also this conversation kind of getting into the realm of solutions for those of us who work in a workplace and may run a workplace. And hopefully you all found this conversation as insightful and fruitful as I did. Allison, I know that we did not dive into your recent work on cognitive labor today, but I would like to assure everyone on the line that we will recirculate Allison's research as well as a link to her Substack newsletter for those of you who are interested in her ongoing takes on sociological phenomena in layperson language. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else that we need to circulate to everyone else. But if I forgot anything, hopefully a member of my team who's on the line will make sure that we send everything to you. So thank you very much, Allison, for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
All right. And thank you to each of you for joining us in the Ideas 42 Academy seminar series. And we look forward to seeing you again in the future.